Hey everybody, Professor Snarp checking in here as we look at Unit 6, William Wordsworth. A quick note on Unit 5 then, the Blake unit. Hopefully you enjoyed getting a taste of the visual aspect of Blake's work and found it, if not enjoyable, then certainly odd and kind of captivating, at least for some of us. Blake is sort of one of those love-hate things. Either you're just not really into it, or it's completely engaging and captivating, which is what it ended up being for me. I really liked how some people included some of that visual stuff in the questions or responses they were doing too. That was really great. Okay, so we move into Wordsworth here, and I'm just looking at our the reading assignments that we have. So I'll sort of comment on these as we go. Actually, let me skip to the couple at the end. There's one that is fairly famous of his, is Intimations of Immortality. We're going to read this as just one of those things that's important to read from Wordsworth. There's so much kind of philosophical context that is informing that poem that he was trying to communicate or grapple with, and then all kinds of sort of scholarly debate about exactly what he was doing or what he was thinking, that it's sort of overwhelming just for that one poem alone. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that one, but it's good to read in the context of, learning about Wordsworth. The World is Too Much With Us, again, a fairly famous work of his, one of his sonnets. So it's important even to think about the fact that Wordsworth, that quintessential romantic, and romantics were breaking all the rules, they were still writing at some point, or in some cases, in very traditional forms. There's a lot of differences, or what Wordsworth or someone like Blake might have called a renovation of those forms, as far as doing different things with them or making sort of stylistic changes. But it is a good reminder that even in the Romantic period, it wasn't a dismissal of tradition, entirely, just as a whole. So we'll be looking at The World Is Too Much With Us, actually, for the discussion board, in conjunction with another of his sonnets, Steamboats, Viaducts, and Railways. And what you'll see is the expression of very different ideas, I think, will come fairly clear. And then, so the interesting thing about Wordsworth is, as I note actually in the discussion board piece, he lived a really long life, which is really problematic if you're a poet, and for scholars it presents all kinds of problems. So it's very clever when you're like Keats or Coleridge, you live a fairly intense life and then die young. It's a lot more, it's a lot more thoughtful that way. So Wordsworth, because of the way we academically or from a scholarly perspective, we like to really compartmentalize. So Wordsworth's philosophy of nature is this. Wordsworth believed this, and we like to be able to fill in those blanks as unproblematically as we can. But when you go and live a really long life, then it's maybe no surprise that, like human beings, Wordsworth changed his mind about things. He was actually an inveterate editor of his own work, or reviser, so he continued returning to things. So even some of his most famous work, and his longest, were productions that he returned to many times throughout his life, and at many different, like the space between when he would return to those works was sometimes decades. So the idea of Wordsworth being this sort of consistent philosophy, or the guy who just had always the same ideas about everything, is something that is just like a convenient fiction for us as academics, and is not the case. So he lived from 1770, which was before the Romantic period, until after the Romantic period, 1850. So again, this quintessential romantic was born and died outside of that Romantic period. So any generalizations we tend to make about him are often specific to a time period within his life and a sort of a context for what was going on. And that's a good rule of thumb, actually, for anybody that we study, not just Wordsworth, but it's sort of more pronounced for him just because he did live for such a long time. People accused him of becoming more and more conservative in his old age, but God, when you live that long, you're almost bound to change your mind about some things. So, I think we'll give him a pass on that one. Okay, so He is probably most important, though, or we should understand him as important for our survey of Brit Lit here, as being part of this real revolution, not just in the thinking about poetry and who it's written for, who should write it, how it's written, and all that kind of stuff, but as one of those figures, a little bit like T.S. Eliot, who we'll study later. So Wordsworth is a theorist and a writer, not just of poetry, but about poetry. So one of the first things we'll read here is the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. The Lyrical Ballads is a collection that Wordsworth and Coleridge co-authored together and published. And the preface is obviously this kind of, it's almost like a manifesto that was the product largely of Wordsworth's work, but it came out of a time period in his life and Coleridge's life when they were really, they had a very intense friendship, but this really intense kind of working relationship in terms of writing poems, sort of for each other and then getting feedback, and this really interesting reciprocal relationship that also involved Dorothy Wordsworth. She was instrumental in this as well, and along with a number of other writers. But people like Wordsworth and Coleridge would actually, rent a house. They would move to a particular location to be close to one another so that they could carry on this working relationship. So the preface to the Lyrical Ballads then is this really important Romantic era document that lays out some of the fundamental principles that, at least for Wordsworth and Coleridge, were kind of the basis for the Romantic kind of revolution in terms of poetic style. So you'll find him making a lot of claims about poetry should be the language of men speaking to men, so there's more common sort of language. He was thinking about humanity, so we shouldn't really accuse him of any gender bias any more than anybody else in the time period would have had. So the language of men speaking to men, the appropriateness of common subjects or marginalized figures for poetry, a sort of a more conversational style, even though when we read it today, it's still a little elevated, the diction, you might say. But it was nothing like what had come before. So again, contextually speaking, it really is a kind of revolution in poetry. And then he also had theories about the source of poetry, the nature of inspiration, which is part of something that we sort of looked at with Blake. But one of the famous Wordsworth quotations from the preface then is that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. So this really kind of organic, gut level type of approach. He doesn't talk about the kind of intellectual process of it. He does go on then to say that it's always emotion recollected in tranquility. So there is this kind of editing phase for what's going on. It's not just this immediate burst onto the paper, and that's what the poem is. But it is a real rethinking of the artistic process, particularly, and you might remember comments I made connected with kind of defining the Romantic era generally, the notion that prior to somebody like Wordsworth in that era, the idea of something being artificial or of artifice being evident in a work of art, whether it's poetry, painting, the landscape garden kind of a thing, through the neoclassical period, which is prior to the Romantic period, there really was this kind of insistence on the intellectual craft of something like poetry. So the more that your poem could be witty, the more concise the language could be to express ideas, the more deft the rhyme. In other words, the more obvious those kind of artificial poetic devices could be, the better it was. So for someone like Wordsworth to come along and say, we're going to do the opposite of that, it really was a kind of bold, revolutionary statement. And we remember, too, how the spirit of the age, particularly early on, is just influenced so heavily by the literal revolutions that are happening, either for England directly, the French Revolution just across the Channel, and then across the world, the American Revolution, that was far away geographically, but very close to home for a lot of thinkers and writers in England, many of whom made the trip over to America to be part of the revolution, or at least to be part of, maybe not physically part of the revolution, but certainly part of the thinking and the writing that occurred after it. So Wordsworth is all part of that too. Maybe his most famous work, though, is the one that we'll be reading here, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, etc., etc. The actual title is really long. It's usually just called Tintern Abbey. So one of the most interesting things about Tintern Abbey is that we usually call it Tintern Abbey, and it does reflect on this abbey, which was used up until, I think, the 14th or 15th century by monks, but was then abandoned and became really like a relic, and it was overgrown, the roof had deteriorated, grass was growing on the inside, it's sort of at this neat space. But the abbey really was this combination of the natural world and the artificial world sort of brought together in this one object. But really, really intriguingly, the poem that we call Tintern Abbey never mentions one thing, the abbey. So there's this sort of willful or conscious or maybe subconscious sort of omission or removal of that very thing from the poem. And the poem is largely about Wordsworth's own reflection on the development of his sort of adult poetic mind. In other words, this idea that he tracks from when he was a kid, he just sort of experienced the world in this very immediate way, or when he was younger, and that's all he needed. He didn't need any sort of deeper meaning in things. But as he grew older, he lost that immediacy, that sense of just kind of immediate joy and wonder, that energy. But in recompense, he says, he's gained this deeper sort of poetic insight. And I think one of the things that we need to read the poem for is whether we really believe Wordsworth, whether there's a degree to which he's not totally convinced himself that gaining this more poetic or mature frame of mind really is recompense for that lost energy of youth. He claims it, but there's a lot of evidence throughout the poem that the passage of time and his getting older, he's not really as cool with it as he'd like to say. And he's 28 when he's writing it, so it's not like he's a 50 or 60-year-old reflecting back on his life. But he is kind of at that stage where you're feeling that that maybe youth and that really fiery energy of youth is not something that you can recapture, even if you really wanted to. So to return to this idea of the abbey itself becomes a symbol of the two kinds of time that show up in the poem. Cyclic or natural time, the idea of like the seasons, for example, they come around and come around again, versus more linear or sort of human time. We age, and that process never gets to go backwards. The abbey itself then becomes this, this relic. So it both suffers from that progression of linear time, but it also then reflects this sort of rebirth as it's overtaken by the natural world, and those two cycles, or the two types of time, become kind of enmeshed in this one location. So if Wordsworth is really a little bit concerned with the fact that he suffers like the rest of us from being a part of linear time as opposed to cyclic or natural time, it's maybe no surprise that this poem called Tintern Abbey, he never actually addresses the abbey itself or spends a lot of time talking about it, because it's such a present symbol, or such an obvious symbol for what happens when we're victims of linear time and we don't have access to that natural sort of cyclical time. So it's, again, conscious or subconscious, willful ignorance maybe, or kind of blindness or omission from the poem, almost like he doesn't want to see the abbey because of what's happening to it. So the poem we call Tintern Abbey, it never addresses the abbey itself. The other thing that happens in that poem that gets a lot of attention is the appearance of Dorothy, who's really there throughout, but only gets mentioned at the very end. And lots of scholars take Wordsworth to task for this, but